The interior of the ossuary of Ethelgard did not just feel empty, it felt rejected. Arlo Voss adjusted the oxygen flow on his suit, listening to the rhythmic, slightly metallic wheeze of his own breathing. Every step he took in his heavy, magnetic boots sent a dull thud through the corroded deck plating, a sound that seemed to travel miles through the interconnected hollows of the station before dying out. "Easy now, girl," Arlo muttered to the station, his voice cracking from 3 days of silence. "Don't you go collapsing on me just because I'm looking for a payday. I've got enough ghosts in my head without adding your structural failures to the list." Arlo was a scavenger by trade and a historian by accident. While most scrap rats in the Riftward territories hunted for copper wiring or intact fusion cores, Arlo had a penchant for the junk of the expansion era: physical books, hand-carved trinkets, and encrypted data drives that held nothing but personal letters. To the Merchant Guild, he was a bottom feeder. To himself, he was the only guy keeping the lights on in the Museum of Human Mistakes. His scanner, a battered handheld unit held together by luck and several layers of industrial adhesive, emitted a sharp, jagged chirp. "Well, look at that," Arlo whispered, squinting at the flickering green screen. "Sector 7G is actually hiding something besides radiation pockets and disappointment." He navigated through a collapsed bulkhead, his plasma cutter humming a low, threatening tune at his hip. The air here was thin, tasting of ozone and ancient dust. He was deep in the cryovaults, a place that shouldn't have been powered at all. Yet his scanner was picking up a steady rhythmic energy pulse, like a heartbeat made of electricity. As he overrode the rusted locking mechanism of a heavy iris door, the metal groaned in a long, agonizing shriek. Inside, the room was bathed in a soft, impossible light. It wasn't the harsh glare of emergency LEDs or the orange flicker of a failing reactor. It was a shifting, iridescent glow that reminded Arlo of the bioluminescent tide pools on a planet he'd only seen in vids. In the center of the vault sat an ancient seed pod, its crystalline surface cracked, and slumped against it was a woman. At first, Arlo thought she was a high-end synthetic, a luxury doll left behind by some fleeing oligarch. Her skin was a translucent, pale ivory that seemed to pulse with a faint violet light. Her hair was like spun platinum, spilling across the floor like frozen mercury. But it was her ears, long, elegant, and pointed, that made Arlo's heart skip a beat. She wasn't human. She wasn't even a recognized subspecies of the Outer Rim. He knelt beside her, his sensors screaming about an unknown biological signature. Her breathing was shallow, a rasping sound that tore at the silence of the vault. Her clothing, though tattered and stained with what looked like golden ichor, was made of a fabric that felt like woven starlight. "Hey, lady," Arlo said, his voice unusually soft. "You picked a hell of a place for a nap. This sector is strictly do not disturb for anyone who likes having a pulse." She didn't move. Her eyes remained closed, but the violet light beneath her skin flickered dangerously low. Arlo reached into his utility belt and pulled out his last nutrient paste tube, labeled artificial beef flavor, and a small canteen of recycled water. It was a pathetic offering, the kind of meal that made most people wish they had no taste buds, but it was all he had. He squeezed a bit of the paste onto his gloved finger and touched her lip. It was cold, like touching dry ice. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her eyelids fluttered open. Arlo gasped. Her eyes weren't just a color, they were a phenomenon. They were the deep, swirling purple of a nebula, devoid of pupils but filled with a terrifying intelligence. She stared at him, and for the first time in 10 years, Arlo felt the urge to apologize for being alive. "Eat," he managed to say, holding the tube out. I know. It's got the nutritional value of a wet cardboard box and tastes worse, but it'll keep the Reaper from knocking on your door for another hour. You look like you haven't seen a carb since the last supernova." The woman looked at the tube, then at Arlo. Her gaze was clinical, as if she were dissecting his very soul to see if it was worth the effort of observation. Slowly, her hand reached out. Her fingers were long and graceful, and when they brushed his glove, a jolt of static electricity surged through his suit, nearly overloading his biomonitors. She took the tube and swallowed the paste mechanically. She didn't grimace at the taste. She didn't smile. She simply absorbed the energy. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice didn't sound like it came from a throat. It sounded like it was being projected directly into his mind, a melodic chime that vibrated in his marrow. "I'm Arlo," he said, trying to regain his characteristic swagger. "Part-time scrap hunter, full-time disappointment to my parents, and you're currently trespassing on my favorite dump. You got a name, or should I just call you Your Iridescence?" The woman leaned back against the seed pod, her strength returning in small, visible waves of light. "I am Zilia," she whispered, "and you, Scavenger, have just shared your last meal with the architect of the Sovereign Weave." Arlo let out a short, dry laugh. "Right, and I'm the Duke of the Kuiper Belt. Well, Empress Zilia, let's get you on your feet. The Rust Hounds will be patrolling this sector in 20 minutes, and they aren't nearly as charming as I am. They'll strip that fancy dress off you and sell your glow-in-the-dark skin to the highest bidder." He offered his hand. Zilia stared at it as if it were a strange, primitive tool. Finally, she placed her hand in his. The heat was immense now, a warmth that defied the freezing temperatures of the station. As she stood, she seemed to grow, her presence filling the room until the shadows themselves seemed to retreat in awe. "You are a strange creature, Arlo Voss," she said, her violet eyes narrowing. "You have nothing, yet you give. Your species was marked for erasure because of its selfishness. Perhaps the Weaver's calculations were incomplete." Arlo didn't like the sound of erasure, but he was too busy making sure she didn't collapse again to ask. "Yeah, well, calculations are for people with too much time on their hands. Out here, we just call it being a neighbor. Now let's move before the scrap hits the fan." The transit through the mid-decks of Ethelgard was a dance with death. Arlo knew every loose floorboard and every leaking pipe, but with Zilia in tow, he felt like he was carrying a lit fuse through a powder keg. Her skin gave off a steady luminescence that made stealth impossible. "Can you, I don't know, turn the brightness down?" Arlo hissed as they ducked behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. "You're like a neon sign in a dark alley. We might as well be broadcasting our coordinates to every pirate in the sector." Zilia looked down at her hands, the violet light pulsing with her heartbeat. "It is not a choice, Scavenger. It is my essence. To dim my light is to cease to exist." "Great," Arlo grumbled, checking his scanner. "So we're going with the please shoot us strategy. Bold move. I like it." They reached the edge of the residential district, a sprawling cavern of modular housing units that had once held 40,000 souls. Now it was a graveyard of broken dreams and plastic furniture. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant moisture and the metallic tang of slow decay. "Tell me," Zilia said, her voice echoing in Arlo's helmet, "why do you stay here? This place is a husk, a monument to a civilization that forgot how to sustain itself." Arlo stopped, his eyes catching a glimpse of a faded mural on the wall, a painting of a green forest under a blue sky. "Because it's home, Zilia. Not everyone gets 1,000 worlds to play with. Some of us just get the scraps. And if we don't look after the scraps, then the whole story of humanity just ends. I'm not ready for the credits to roll just yet." Zilia touched the mural. Where her fingers met the wall, the faded colors seemed to bleed back to life for a fleeting second before turning to ash. "You value the memory of life more than life itself. It is a fascinating pathology." "Is that a compliment? Because it sounds like something an AI says right before it launches the nukes," Arlo replied, though his heart wasn't in the joke. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a high-pitched electronic howl. "Scrap rat! We know you're in there, Voss!" A voice boomed over the station's internal comms, distorted by static. "We saw the light show from 3 levels up. Give us the girl, and maybe we'll let you keep your oxygen tank." Arlo's jaw tightened. "Rust Hounds, led by a charming fellow named Jax. He has the IQ of a vacuum cleaner and the personality of a radiation burn." "They seek me?" Zilia asked, her posture straightening. "They seek anything they can sell," Arlo said, unholstering his plasma cutter. The tool hummed, its blue blade extending 20 centimeters. "And right now, you're the most expensive thing in the galaxy. Stay behind me. I've lived on this station for 10 years, and I'm not about to let a bunch of bottom feeders ruin my record." 12 men emerged from the shadows of the housing units. They wore mismatched armor plating and carried heavy kinetic rifles. Jax, a man whose face was more scar tissue than skin, stepped forward, his eyes widening as he saw Zilia. "Sweet mother of stars," Jax whispered. "She's real. I thought the boys were hallucinating on recycled air. That's a sovereign, isn't it? The kind of prize that buys a man his own moon." "Back off, Jax," Arlo said, his voice steady despite the hammer of his heart. "She's with me, and she's not a prize. She's a guest." "A guest?" Jax laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're sharing your cardboard paste with a goddess, Voss? You always were a soft-headed scrap rat. Boys, take the girl. Try not to scuff the merchandise. Kill the rat." The first soldier moved forward, raising his rifle. Arlo didn't hesitate. He dived forward, sliding across the slick deck plating, and swung the plasma cutter in a wide arc. The blade sliced through the soldier's weapon like it was made of butter. "Bug out, Zilia! Run to the ventilation shafts," Arlo yelled, kicking another soldier in the knee. But Zilia didn't run. She stood in the center of the corridor, her arms spread wide. The violet light from her skin intensified until it was blinding, a roar of energy that filled the room. "You would lay hands upon an architect?" she spoke, and this time her voice didn't just chime. It thundered. The very air around her began to vibrate, and Arlo saw the atoms themselves begin to pull apart in tiny, shimmering sparks. The soldiers froze, their weapons shaking. Even Jax took a step back, his bravado evaporating. What are you?" "I am the end of your equation," Zilia said. She raised a hand and a wave of pure, translucent force ripples through the air. It wasn't an explosion, it was a reorganization. The crates, the debris, and the soldiers themselves were pushed back as if the universe had simply decided they didn't belong in that specific coordinate of space. The rust hounds scrambled, fleeing back into the darkness, leaving their weapons behind. Arlo stood up, dusting off his suit, his eyes wide as he looked at Zilia. The light was fading now, leaving her looking pale and exhausted. "Whoa," Arlo breathed. "Note to self, do not get on your bad side. That was some serious null-matter pulse stuff right there." Zilia swayed, and Arlo caught her before she hit the deck. Her weight felt different now, heavier, as if she were becoming more tied to the physical world. "It cost me," she whispered, her eyes dulling to a faint lavender. "The Weaver does not permit such displays of power on a dying world. The balance is disturbed." "Forget the balance," Arlo said, hoisting her arm over his shoulder. "We need to get to my hab module. It's not a palace, but it's got a reinforced door and a hidden stash of actual coffee. Well, it's 80% chicory, but we don't tell the taste buds that." As he led her away from the scene of the skirmish, Arlo realized his hands were shaking. He had just defended a woman who could likely unmake him with a thought, and she had used the last of her strength to stay by his side instead of fleeing. "Why didn't you leave?" Arlo asked as they climbed a maintenance ladder. "You could have flown out of here the moment those guys showed up." Zilia leaned her head against his shoulder. Her skin felt warm, almost comforting. "You fed me when I was nothing," she said softly. "In the sovereign weave, we are taught that a debt of the soul is the only one that cannot be erased by time. You are a flawed, dirty, and loud creature, Arlo Voss, but you are not a variable I am ready to delete." Arlo smiled, a genuine one this time. "Good to know. Now let's get home." "I think I've had enough excitement for one light year." The HAB module was a repurposed shipping container wedged into the structural ribs of the station's tertiary spine. It was small, cramped, and smelled perpetually of ozone and old socks. But to Arlo Voss, it was a sanctuary. He practically dragged Zilia through the pressure-sealed hatch, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. The adrenaline that had fueled his escape from the rust hounds was beginning to fizz out, leaving behind a cold, sharp ache in his side, where a kinetic round had skipped off his armor and shattered two of his ribs. "Sit down," Arlo wheezed, gesturing toward a bunk covered in a patchwork of thermal blankets and scavenged fabrics. "Just give me a second to find the override for the atmospheric scrubbers." Zilia did not sit. She moved through the tiny space with the eerie grace of a predator in a cage too small for its dignity. Her violet light was dim now, a soft, dying ember glow that cast long, flickering shadows against the walls lined with Arlo's treasures. She touched a stack of physical books, her fingers tracing the cracked leather spines with a curiosity that seemed almost painful. "You are bleeding, Arlo Voss," she said. Her voice was no longer a thunderous command. It was a soft, melodic friction that made the hair on his arm stand up. "The internal structural integrity of your chest cavity is compromised." "Yeah, well, that's just a Tuesday in the Riftward territories," Arlo grunted. He slumped into a pilot's chair that had seen better centuries and began unstrapping his chest plate. The metal was scorched and dented, a testament to how close he had come to being a permanent part of the deck plating. "I've had worse. Once had a coolant leak melt half the skin off my left arm. This is just a souvenir." He managed to peel back the undersuit, revealing a massive, blossoming bruise the color of a bruised plum. Every breath was a gamble, a sharp needle of pain that made his vision swim with static. He reached for a medical kit, a battered metal box marked with the faded cross of a long-dead relief organization, and pulled out a stim pen. Zelia walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the metal floor. She knelt between his legs, her violet eyes searching the wound. Arlo tried to pull away, a reflex born of a decade spent trusting no one with his vulnerabilities. "Don't touch it," he muttered, his voice dropping an octave. "Your hands are like dry ice, lady. I'm already shivering enough as it is." "I am not merely cold," Zelia said, her gaze locking onto his. "I am an architect. I see the subatomic vibration of your cells. I see where the harmony has been broken. You took this damage to facilitate my departure." "Why?" Arlo hesitated, the stim pen hovering inches from his thigh. "Because you were the only thing on this entire godforsaken station that wasn't trying to rot or break," he said finally. "Because for a minute there, looking at you in that vault, I forgot I was a scrap rat. I felt like maybe I was part of something that mattered. Now quit the chatter and let me juice up. This stim pen is 3 years past its expiration date, so it's probably going to kick like a mule." Zelia reached out, her fingers hovering just millimeters from his skin. Arlo felt the static electricity again, a tingling warmth that seemed to pull the pain right out of his nerves. "Wait," Arlo gasped. "If you do that light show thing, you said it costs you. You're already fading. Don't waste it on a grunt like me. I can heal the old-fashioned way. It takes 2 weeks and a lot of swearing, but it works." "The cost is irrelevant when the debt is unpaid," she replied. A pulse of brilliant amethyst light erupted from her palms. Arlo's back arched as a sensation of intense heat flooded his chest. It wasn't the searing burn of a plasma cutter, but something deeper, more invasive. He felt his ribs knitting together, the shattered bone fragments aligning with a series of wet, sickening clicks. The bruise didn't just fade, it vanished, the blood being reabsorbed into his system with impossible speed. For 30 seconds, Arlo Voss forgot how to breathe. When the light finally receded, Zelia slumped against his knees, her skin turning a dull, matte gray. The iridescent glow was gone. She looked human now, or a terrifyingly pale imitation of one. "Are you crazy?" Arlo shouted, though it came out as a raspy whisper. He grabbed her shoulders, feeling how light she was, almost as if she were losing physical density. "You could have flatlined yourself for 2 ribs? I'm a dime a dozen, Zelia. There are millions of guys like me scraping the rust off the galaxy. You're a goddess or an empress or whatever. You don't trade gold for lead." Zelia looked up, her violet eyes dimmed to the color of a twilight sky. "Lead survives in conditions where gold melts," she whispered. "You are not a grunt. You are a curator of ghosts. I chose to preserve the curator." Arlo stared at her, the anger in his chest melting into something heavy and uncomfortable. He had spent his entire life learning that everything had a price, and usually that price was paid in blood or credits. To have someone, especially a celestial being, pay that price for him out of nothing but a sense of debt was a concept his cynical brain couldn't quite process. He reached into a hidden compartment beneath his bunk and pulled out a small, airtight canister. He opened it with a hiss of escaping gas, revealing a handful of dark, oily beans. "Real coffee," he said, his voice thick. "Not the synthetic sludge, not the chicory root trash I usually drink. This is from a stash I found in a high-ranking officer's locker 6 months ago." I was saving it for the day I finally retired, or the day the station finally fell into the sun, whichever came first. Zelia watched as he ground the beans by hand, using a primitive mortar and pestle. The aroma filled the hab module, rich, earthy, and undeniably ancient. He boiled a small amount of water over a portable heating element and poured it into two mismatched ceramic mugs. Here, Arlo said, handing her a cup. Sip it slow. It's bitter, but it'll wake up your systems. It's the closest thing to life support we've got left in this sector. Zelia took the mug, mirroring the way Arlo held his. She took a small sip and winced, her nose wrinkling in a way that made her look suddenly, startlingly young. It is aggressive, she remarked. That's humanity for you, Arlo said, leaning back in his chair and feeling the impossible sturdiness of his healed ribs. We're bitter, we're aggressive, and we've got a real nasty aftertaste. But we keep you warm in the dark. Zelia looked at the steam rising from her mug. Your species was marked for termination by the Weaver 42 years ago. The report stated that humanity was a viral strain, consuming resources without contributing to the cosmic harmony. I was sent here to verify the failure before the final erasure began. Arlo froze, his mug halfway to his lips. Erasure? You mean genocide? We do not use that word, Zelia said, her voice regaining a trace of its cold authority. We call it harvest. We reclaim the matter to seed more promising civilizations. But I crashed. My vessel was intercepted by a gravitational anomaly, and I was forced into stasis within the cryovault. For 40 years, I slept while your people tore themselves apart. And you think we're still a failure? Arlo asked, gesturing to the cramped, rusting room around them. I thought so, she admitted. Until a man who had nothing but a tube of artificial beef and a few broken ribs decided that a stranger's life was worth more than his own. You are an anomaly, Arlo Voss. A glitch in the equation? Arlo took a long, slow gulp of the coffee. Well, maybe the Weaver needs to check its math, because out here, in the dirt and the scrap, the only thing that keeps us going is the stuff that doesn't make sense. Now drink your coffee, architect. We've got work to do. If the Weaver's coming to harvest us, I'd like to make sure we're as difficult to pick as possible. The environmental systems of the ossuary were failing. Arlo could feel it in the way the air had become thin and brittle, smelling of ozone and the metallic tang of ionizing radiation. Zelia's display of power in the corridor had tripped the station's remaining circuit breakers, and now the tertiary spine was plunging into a deep, lethargic freeze. We can't stay here, Arlo said, pulling on a heavy thermal parka over his undersuit. My HAB's life support is drawing from a backup battery that won't last more than 12 hours. If we want to breathe by tomorrow morning, we need to get to the central archive. It's got an independent fusion cell that's been humming since the expansion era. Zelia stood, her movement still somewhat stiff. Her skin had regained a faint, pearlescent sheen, but the brilliant violet light remained absent. The archive, she repeated. You believe the answers to your survival are buried in the past? I believe the power to keep us warm is buried there, Arlo corrected, checking the charge on his plasma cutter. And maybe a few things worth seeing before the lights go out for good. It's 3 kilometers from here, through the ventilation shafts in the old hydroponics bay. It's going to be a rough walk. The journey was a descent into a mechanical underworld. They crawled through narrow conduits where the walls were slick with condensation and black mold. Arlo led the way, his helmet lamp cutting a lonely path through the darkness. Zelia followed, her silent presence a weight behind him. They passed through the hydroponics bay, a vast, vaulted chamber that had once fed thousands. Now it was a jungle of mutated pale flora that grew in the dark, fueled by leaking nutrient lines. Ghostly vines dangled from the ceiling like weeping willow branches, glowing with a sickly green bioluminescence. Do not touch the creepers, Arlo warned, his voice a low hiss. They've evolved to sense body heat. They'll wrap around your suit and won't let go until you're as cold as the deck plating. Zelia paused, looking at a cluster of flowers that resembled transparent bells. They are beautiful, she whispered, even in their corruption. Beauty is a luxury we can't afford right now, Arlo said, though he stopped to let her look. Move it, Zelia. The temperature is dropping. An hour later, they reached the archive. It was a massive circular drum suspended in the center of the station's core. Unlike the rest of Ethelgard, the archive was meticulously clean. The air here was crisp and filtered, and the floor was made of polished obsidian that reflected Arlo's light. "This is it," Arlo said, his voice echoing. "The Hall of Records. Everything humanity ever did, thought, or broke is recorded in the data crystals here." Zelia walked into the center of the room. As she approached the main console, the floor began to glow with a soft amber light. A holographic projection shimmered into existence, a three-dimensional map of the galaxy, dotted with thousands of points of light. "These are your colonies," Zelia said, her voice filled with a strange sadness. "So many, and yet so few remain." Arlo walked over to a shelf filled with physical data crystals, each one the size of a thumb and glowing with its own internal frequency. "We were ambitious," he said. "We reached for the stars before we knew how to hold on to them. We built this station as a bridge, a place where all the knowledge of the human race could be stored in case the worst happened." "And the worst did happen," Zelia noted. "The collapse wars." Arlo nodded. "We fought over who got to lead the bridge instead of just crossing it. But look at this." He pulled a crystal from the shelf and slotted it into a nearby viewer. A screen flickered to life, showing a grainy video of a woman standing in a field of yellow flowers. She was holding a small child, and they were both laughing. There was no sound, but the joy was unmistakable. "That's a personal log," Arlo said. "There are millions of them here. Not just treaties and technical manuals, but stories, songs, pictures of pets, letters to people who would never read them. The Merchant Guild wants the technical data, the weapon specs, the engine designs. But this is what I scavenge for." Zelia watched the video, her violet eyes widening. "Why preserve this? It has no strategic value. It does not help your species survive." "Because it's why we should survive," Arlo said, stepping closer to her. "The Weaver looks at us and sees a failed experiment. It sees the wars and the waste. But it doesn't see this. It doesn't see the way we love things that are destined to break. It doesn't see the coffee or the jokes or the way we keep painting forests on the walls of a tin can." Zelia turned away from the screen, her expression unreadable. "You speak as if these small things can outweigh the destruction your kind has wrought. The sovereign weave does not value sentiment, Arlo Voss. We value equilibrium. And humanity has tipped the scales too far toward chaos." "Then maybe the scales are wrong," Arlo snapped. He walked over to a secondary console and began bypass coding the power grid. His fingers flew across the holographic keys with practiced ease. "If you want to see who we really are, don't look at the wars. Look at the fact that even when we were dying, we built a place to remember the color of the sky." Suddenly, a red light began to pulse on the main display. A proximity alert chimed, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floor. Arlo's face went pale. "They're here." "Who?" Zelia asked. "Not the rust hounds," Arlo said, his voice trembling. "The sensors are picking up a signature that isn't human. It's too clean, too powerful. It's a sovereign ship, Zelia. Your people. They found the pulse you sent out when you healed me." Zelia looked at the screen. The ship was a silver needle, sleek and terrifying, cutting through the void toward Ethelgard. It was beautiful, in the way a scalpel is beautiful before it cuts. "My honor guard," she whispered. "Commander Caleth." "Is that a good thing?" Arlo asked, grabbing his pack and checking the charge on his cutter. "Are they here to take you home or to finish the harvest?" Zelia didn't answer. She looked at the video of the woman in the field of flowers, which was still looping on the viewer. The woman laughed again, her silent joy a stark contrast to the cold, silver death approaching from the stars. "They are here for me," Zelia said finally, "and they will expect me to give the order to begin the erasure. The station is a focal point, Arlo. Once I am aboard the flagship, the ossuary will be the first thing to be converted back into raw energy, along with everything and everyone inside it." Arlo looked around the archive. He looked at the crystals, the obsidian floors, and the millions of ghosts he had spent his life protecting. Then he looked at Zelia, the woman who had traded her divinity for his broken ribs. "Then we've got about 20 minutes to change your mind," he said, his voice cracking but firm. Because I'm not leaving my coffee behind, and I'm definitely not leaving you. Xylia looked at him, and for the first time Arlo saw a flicker of something that wasn't logic or debt in her violet eyes. It was fear. The architect was afraid of her own architecture. "We need to get to the observation deck," Arlo said, grabbing her hand. "If you're going to kill us all, at least have the decency to look us in the eye while you do it." They began to run, their footsteps echoing through the Hall of Broken Records as the silver needle of the Sovereign Fleet began to dock with the station. The air grew colder, but Arlo didn't care. He held her hand tight, a scavenger and an empress, racing against a clock that had been ticking for 1,000 worlds. The observation deck of the ossuary of Ethelgard was a cathedral of glass and despair. Once it had been the crown jewel of the station, a place where diplomats from 100 colonies gathered to toast to a future that never arrived. Now the reinforced crystal was pitted by micrometeoroid strikes and streaked with the frozen tears of ancient atmospheric leaks. Outside, the starscape was dominated by the silver needle of the sovereign flagship. It was nearly 5 kilometers of polished, biosynthetic hull that seemed to drink the light of the distant dying sun. Arlo Voss stood at the edge of the viewport, his reflection a ghost of grime and scavenged tech against the backdrop of imperial perfection. He felt small. He had spent his entire life thinking he was a big fish in the small, rusty pond of the Riftward territories. But looking at that ship, he realized he was just a flea on a dying dog. Beside him, Xylia stood tall. Even without her full violet glow, she possessed a gravity that made the vacuum outside feel crowded. "They're docking at Bay 4, Arlo said, checking his wrist-mounted scanner for the 10th time. "I'm tracking 30, no, 40 high-energy signatures moving through the primary umbilical." "These aren't just suit jockeys, Xylia. These are heavy hitters, high-output bioluminescence, probably armored to the teeth." Xylia did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the silver needle. "Commander Calith does not travel without the Silver Guard. They are the elite of the weave, trained to neutralize any variable that threatens the equilibrium. They will see this station as a containment breach. They will see you as a parasite." Arlo checked the battery on his plasma cutter. It was at 42%, not enough to take down a god, but enough to make one feel the heat. "Well, I've been called worse by better people. What's the play here, Empress? Do I play the humble servant, or do we go out swinging?" "You do nothing," Xylia commanded, her voice regaining that razor-sharp edge of authority. "You stay in the shadows of the machinery. If Calith sees you, he will not ask questions. He will simply delete the noise." The airlock at the far end of the deck hissed, not with the protesting grind of human machinery, but with a sound like a soft, collective sigh. The heavy doors slid open, and a mist of supercooled gas swirled onto the deck. Out of the fog stepped the Silver Guard. They wore armor that looked like it had been poured from liquid moonlight, flowing and seamless, with helmets that featured no visors, only smooth glowing plates of amethyst light. They moved in perfect, terrifying synchronicity. At their head walked a man who made Arlo's internal alarms scream. He was taller than Xylia, his skin a deep, bruised purple, and his hair a shock of white that looked like static electricity. This was Commander Calith. He didn't walk so much as he glided, his every movement a testament to 1,000 years of martial discipline. He stopped 10 meters from Xylia. The Silver Guard fanned out, their weapons, slender staves that hummed with a low, bone-shaking frequency, leveled at the shadows where Arlo crouched behind a derelict sensor array. "Radiance," Calith said, dropping to one knee in a salute that looked more like a threat. "The weave has been dim without your light. We feared the harvest had claimed its own architect." Xylia stepped forward, her hands clasped behind her back. Arlo noticed she was hiding her palms. The skin there was still scarred from the energy she had used to heal him. "Rise, Calith. You are late. I have been in stasis for 40 years. 40 years is but a blink in the eyes of the Weaver," Calith replied, standing up. His voice was like grinding stones. "But the signals we received from the sector were erratic. Biorhythmic spikes that suggested a sovereign was interfering with local matter. We assumed you were being tortured by the primitives." "I was not tortured," Xylia said, her voice cool. "I was observing. Calith's head tilted slightly, a predatory gesture. Observing the rot? This station is a tomb of a failed species. It should have been reclaimed decades ago. Why is it still drawing power? Why are the data crystals still intact? Arlo shifted his weight, and a piece of loose scrap metal under his boot gave a tiny metallic clink. It was no louder than a heartbeat, but in the oppressive silence of the deck, it sounded like a gunshot. Instantly, 5 staves were pointed at Arlo's position. "Identify the noise," Calith barked. Zelia moved, placing herself directly between Calith and Arlo's hiding spot. "It is nothing. A structural failure. The station is collapsing." Calith's amethyst eyes narrowed. "You lie, Radiance. An architect does not lie. It is against the protocols of your creation. There is a biological signature behind that array. It is warm. It is carbon-based. It is human." He gestured with a flick of his wrist. 2 guards moved forward, their boots silent. Arlo knew the gig was up. He couldn't outrun them, and he couldn't out-hide them. He stood up, unholstering his plasma cutter, but keeping the blade retracted. He stepped out into the light, looking every bit the scruffy, desperate scavenger he was. "Easy there, glowworms," Arlo said, his voice shaky but his eyes defiant. "I'm just the janitor. You guys are trespassing on a strictly no-soliciting zone." Calith stared at Arlo with a look of profound disgust, the way a king might look at a maggot on his dinner plate. "A scavenger. You have been dwelling in the presence of the Empress. You have touched the radiance with those filthy, primitive hands." "He saved my life," Zelia said, her voice ringing with a desperate power. The silence that followed was absolute. Calith looked at Zelia, then back at Arlo, and then at the scars on Zelia's hands. A slow, cold realization dawned on the commander's face. "You used the Chronos loom," Calith whispered, his voice thick with horror. "You dived into the subatomic threads to repair this animal? You traded your divinity for a scavenger's ribcage?" "He was hungry," Zelia said, and for the first time she sounded small. "He shared his last meal with me when I was nothing but a ghost in a vault. He protected me from his own kind. He showed me the archive, Calith. He showed me why we were wrong about them." "Wrong?" Calith roared, the amethyst light on his armor flaring into a violent crimson. "We are never wrong. Equilibrium is the only truth. This species has spent 2 centuries burning their own house down. They are a cancer on the sector. And you, the most brilliant mind of our generation, you have been infected by their sentimentality." He turned to his guards. "Secure the Empress. Prepare her for the cleansing." As for the animal, Calith raised his staff. The tip began to glow with a blinding white light. "No!" Zelia screamed, reaching out for Calith's arm. Arlo didn't wait. He didn't have the power of a god, but he had the reflexes of a man who had been dodging falling bulkheads since he was 12 years old. He thumbed the trigger on his plasma cutter. The blue blade hissed into existence, and he lunged forward. He wasn't trying to kill Calith. He knew he couldn't. He was aiming for the power coupling on the back of the commander's neck, a small glowing node he had identified using his scavenger's eye for technical weakness. The blue blade struck the silver armor with a shower of sparks. Calith grunted, his staff discharging a wild bolt of energy that shattered a nearby viewport. The hiss of escaping atmosphere filled the room instantly, a screaming vacuum that tried to pull everyone toward the stars. "Magnetic boots!" Arlo yelled, slamming his heels down as his suit's emergency clamps engaged. The Sovereign Guards were caught off guard. Their high-tech armor relied on grav levitation, which was useless in a sudden decompression event. They tumbled toward the jagged hole in the crystal, their amethyst lights flickering in the dark. Zelia grabbed a structural pillar, her fingers digging into the metal. Calith, however, was a mountain. He didn't budge. He grabbed Arlo by the throat with one hand, lifting him off the deck even as the air screamed past them. "You think a toy can stop me?" Calith sneered, his grip tightening. "I will watch the light leave your eyes before I turn this station into ash." He threw Arlo across the deck. Arlo hit a bulkhead with a sickening thud, his vision turning black at the edges. He felt his suit's integrity failing. A red warning light flashed in his peripheral vision. "Oxygen leak. Estimated time to suffocation, 5 minutes. Enough!" Celia's voice wasn't a scream this time. It was a frequency. The air stopped moving. The hole in the viewport was suddenly sealed by a shimmering curtain of violet energy. Zelia stood in the center of the deck, her eyes no longer purple, but a brilliant, terrifying white. She had tapped into the station's remaining fusion core, using her own body as a conductor. Caliph, she said, and her voice sounded like 1,000 people speaking at once. If you kill him, I will unmake the flagship. I will unravel the threads of every sovereign ship in this sector. I am the architect. I built the ships you fly. I know where the seams are. Caliph froze. He looked at the flagship outside, then at the woman who looked more like a star than a person. You would commit treason for a scrap rat? I would commit justice for a friend, she replied. Caliph lowered his head. The crimson light on his armor faded back to a cold amethyst. Very well, Radiance. If the animal means that much to you, he shall witness the harvest from the bridge of the flagship. He will see his world die, and then he will understand the mercy of our logic. He looked at Arlo, who was gasping for air on the floor. Take them both. If the scavenger moves, kill him. If he speaks, kill him. We leave this graveyard immediately. The Silver Guard moved in, their movements cold and clinical. Arlo felt a heavy, cold weight settle on his wrists as magnetic shackles locked into place. He looked at Celia. She was staring at him, her eyes returning to their normal violet, filled with a sadness so deep it felt like a physical weight. I'm sorry, Arlo, she whispered. Arlo managed a bloody grin. Hey, I always wanted to see the inside of a fancy ship. Just hope they've got better snacks than I do. The flagship of the Sovereign Weave, known in their tongue as the Loom of Eternity, was a place of impossible silence and sterile beauty. To Arlo Voss, it felt like being trapped inside a giant, expensive clock. There were no wires, no greasy pipes, and no smells. It was a world of white light and curves, where the walls felt like skin and the floors hummed with the vibration of 1,000 miniature stars. They had stripped Arlo of his environment suit and his scavenged gear. He was now wearing a simple gray tunic made of a fabric that felt like spider silk, but was tougher than Kevlar. He felt naked without the weight of his tools. He was sitting in a circular room with no doors, only a shimmering energy field that kept him contained. He had been there for 6 hours according to the internal clock of his own brain. Or maybe it was 60 years. It was hard to tell when there were no shadows. The energy field flickered and died. Celia stepped into the room. She was no longer the tattered refugee from the vault. She was draped in a gown of woven light that shifted colors with her mood, currently a deep, somber indigo. On her brow sat a circlet of crystallized starlight that pulsed with a rhythmic, intimidating power. You look like 1,000,000 credits, Arlo said, leaning back against the wall. Or whatever currency you guys use. Galactic marks? Soul shards? We use nothing so crude as currency, Zelia said, her voice echoing in the small room. We use contribution. Everyone in the weave provides a thread. My thread is the design of reality. Must be nice, Arlo grunted, being the one who gets to decide what the blanket looks like. I'm guessing my thread is just a loose end you're looking to snip off. Zelia sat on a bench that grew out of the floor as she approached it. I have spent the last 4 hours arguing for your life, Arlo. Caliph wanted to execute you for the crime of existing in my presence. I have managed to convince the High Council that you are a valuable specimen of human resilience. Specimen, Arlo repeated, the word tasting like copper in his mouth. That's a real nice way of saying lab rat. So, what's the sit rep? Are we still on for the planet cracking? Or did my charm finally win over the council? Zelia looked at her hands. The scars were gone, replaced by smooth, iridescent skin, but she still rubbed her palms as if they hurt. The harvest is scheduled for 1,800 hours tomorrow. The flagship is currently positioning itself over your home world, the one you call Earth. Arlo felt his stomach drop. Earth? Nobody lives there anymore, Zelia. It's a dust bowl, a radioactive park. Why waste the energy? Because it is the origin point, she said. The Weaver believes that to truly erase a failure, you must delete the source code. Once Earth is reclaimed, the rest of the colonies in the Riftward territories will lose their sense of history. They will wither and die on their own within 2 generations. It is a cleaner way to end a species than total war. That's cold, Xylia. That's colder than the void, Arlo said, standing up. He began to pace the small room, his bare feet silent on the floor. You saw the archive. You saw the videos. You saw that woman and her kid. You really think that deserves to be source deleted? I am one voice among 10,000, Arlo. I am an architect, not a judge. You're the Empress, Arlo snapped, stopping in front of her. You're the Radiance. If you can't change their minds, who can? The sovereign weave is built on logic, Arlo, not passion. Calith presented the data. Your wars, your pollution, your greed, your inability to cooperate. The data is overwhelming. Against that, I have... What? A scavenger who shared a protein bar? A video of a mother who has been dead for 2 centuries? It's not just a protein bar, Xylia. It's the choice. Arlo leaned in, his face inches from hers. You said we were a viral strain. You said we only consume. But I had nothing. I was 3 meals away from starving, and I gave you half. Why would a virus do that? Why would a parasite risk its life to fix the ribs of its host? Xylia didn't look away. I don't know, she whispered. It defies every equation I have ever written. Then rewrite the damn equation, Arlo yelled. Use your fancy loom and weave us a new one. Show them that we're not just the things we break. Show them we're the things we try to fix. Before Xylia could respond, the room began to vibrate. A low, rhythmic thrumming sound filled the air, like the purr of a giant cat. The primary ignition sequence has begun, Xylia said, her face turning pale. Calith is moving ahead of schedule. He wants to prove that your influence hasn't compromised the mission. Arlo grabbed her by the shoulders. His hands were rough and calloused, a stark contrast to the smooth perfection of her gown. Take me to the bridge. What? No. They'll kill you the second you step out of this room. Take me to the bridge, Xylia. If my world is going to die, I want to be there to tell the guy pressing the button that he's a coward. I want to look at your council and tell them that they're the ones who are failing, because they've forgotten what it's like to be small. They've forgotten that the only thing that makes the universe worth building is the people who live in it. Xylia stared at him, her violet eyes swimming with a mixture of fear and admiration. You would face the High Council? Naked and unarmed? I've faced a lot worse with a lot less, Arlo said. Come on, Empress. Give me a shot. What's the worst that could happen? They kill me. I'm already on the menu. Xylia stood up, the light of her gown shifting from indigo to a fierce burning gold. Her circlet pulsed with a renewed intensity. You are a fool, Arlo Voss, a reckless, illogical, wonderful fool. She waved her hand and the energy field vanished. She didn't look back as she stepped into the corridor. Follow me, scavenger. And try not to make any jokes. The High Council doesn't have a sense of humor. The walk to the bridge was a blur of silver corridors and staring guards. Arlo felt the weight of 1,000 worlds pressing down on him. He saw sovereign citizens, men and women who looked like gods, watching him with expressions ranging from pity to utter loathing. He saw the sheer scale of their technology, the way they manipulated light and gravity like it was clay. They were perfect, and that was the problem. They were so perfect they had forgotten how to be kind. The bridge of the loom of eternity was a massive sphere of glass. In the center sat a circular dais where 12 figures in white robes stood in a circle, their hands linked by threads of light. In the center of the circle was Calith, his hand hovering over a glowing orb of pure white energy. Below them, filling the entire lower half of the sphere, was Earth. It was a beautiful, broken marble of blue and brown, swirled with white clouds. From this height, you couldn't see the ruins or the radiation. You could only see a planet that was trying its best to breathe. Radiance, Calith said, not turning around. You are just in time. The primary beam is at 98%. We were just discussing the efficiency of the reclaim. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw Arlo. Why is the animal on the bridge? Because he has a statement for the council, Xylia said, her voice carrying a weight that made even the robed figures look up. Calith laughed, a cold, sharp sound. A statement? From a scavenger? What could he possibly say that would change the destiny of a galaxy? Arlo stepped forward. He felt the eyes of the High Council on him. 12 ancient, powerful beings who had decided the fate of 1,000 worlds. He felt the coldness of the bridge, the sterile perfection of it all. He looked at the glowing orb in Calith's hand. He looked at Earth below. "I'm not here to beg," Arlo said, his voice echoing in the sphere. "I know what you see when you look at us. You see a bunch of monkeys who found some matches and started a fire. And you're not wrong. We've done a lot of stupid things. We've killed each other over lines in the dirt. We've poisoned the water we drink." He took another step, his gaze moving from one counselor to the next. "But you guys, you're supposed to be the smart ones. You're the architects. You're the ones who designed the stars. And yet, you're about to do the same thing we did. You're about to solve a problem by destroying it." "That is not destruction," one of the counselors said, her voice like a chorus of bells. "It is reclamation. We are returning the energy to the weave." "Call it whatever you want," Arlo snapped. "It's still a choice to stop caring. You say we're a failure because we couldn't cooperate? Well, look at you. You're so afraid of a little bit of chaos that you'd rather have a dead universe that's neat and tidy than a living one that's messy." He pointed to Zilia. "She fell. She was dying, and she was one of yours. Any of you would have left her there if the logic didn't add up. But I didn't. Not because it was logical, not because I thought I'd get a reward. I did it because she was alone, and she was hurting." Arlo looked Calith in the eye. "That's the thing you're missing from your equations. Kindness isn't logical, it's a glitch. But it's the only glitch that makes the rest of the machine worth running. If you kill us, you're not just deleting a failure. You're deleting the only thing in this galaxy that's brave enough to be kind when it makes no sense." Calith's face twisted in rage. "Enough! The beam is at 100%. He moved his hand toward the orb. "Calith, wait!" Zilia stepped forward, her hand outstretched. The commander didn't listen. His palm touched the surface of the orb. A sound like the birth of a star filled the bridge. A pillar of white light erupted from the bottom of the flagship, a lance of pure energy that stretched down toward the surface of the earth. Arlo fell to his knees, shielding his eyes. He felt the heat, the sheer power of the harvest. He thought of the archive. He thought of the videos of the laughing children. He thought of the green forests painted on the walls of a tin can. It was over, but the explosion didn't come. The white light hit the atmosphere of the earth and began to spread. It didn't pierce the crust. It didn't boil the oceans. It began to weave itself into a shimmering golden web that encased the entire planet. Calith stared at the orb, his hands shaking. What is this? The reclamation sequence has been bypassed." He looked at Zilia. Her hands were glowing with a soft, violet light. She was linked to the central console, her eyes closed in concentration. "I didn't delete the source code, Calith," she whispered, her voice amplified by the ship's systems. "I updated it." The golden web began to descend, sinking into the clouds of the earth. As it touched the surface, the brown patches began to turn green. The gray oceans began to turn a deep, vibrant blue. The radioactive clouds began to disperse. You're fixing it," Arlo breathed, standing up. "I am giving them a second chance," Zilia said, opening her eyes. "I have used the energy of the harvest to jumpstart the planet's biosphere. It will take 100 years for the air to be fully breathable, and 1,000 years for the forest to return. But the rot is gone. The balance has been restored, not through erasure, but through growth." Calith let out a scream of fury and lunged at Zilia, his silver staff raised. "Stop!" The voice came from the High Council. The lead counselor, a being whose skin was as clear as glass, stepped forward. Calith froze. The counselor looked at the screen, at the earth glowing with a new, vibrant life. She looked at Zilia, and then she looked at Arlo. "The architect has performed a miracle," the counselor said softly. "She has found a solution that was not in the data. She has introduced the variable of kindness into the weave." She turned to Arlo. "You are a very loud animal, Arlo Voss, but you have spoken a truth that we have been deaf to for far too long." Calith lowered his staff, his head bowed in shame. "The harvest is cancelled," the counselor declared. The flagship will remain in orbit for 1 week to monitor the stabilization. After that, we will depart this sector. Zelia collapsed, her energy spent. Arlo caught her, holding her tight against his chest. Her skin was warm, and her heart was beating with a steady human rhythm. "We did it," Arlo whispered. Celia smiled, her eyes flickering with a faint, beautiful violet light. "No, Arlo, you did it. I just did the math." As the Sovereign fleet began to pull back from the newly green world, Arlo looked out the viewport. He saw the stars, and for the first time in his life, they didn't look like cold points of light in a dark void. They looked like possibilities. The silence of the flagship was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, a suffocating blanket of uncertainty that pressed against Arlo's chest. He spent most of the following day staring out of the transparent hull of his quarters, watching the emerald green of the new Earth spread like a slow, deliberate ink stain across the brown parchment of the continents. It was a miracle, a genuine cosmic act of grace, yet Arlo felt like a man standing on a gallows waiting for the rope to snap. He was no longer shackled, but he was certainly not free. The Sovereign Silver Guard stood outside his door, their amethyst eyes following his every movement through the shimmering energy field. To them, he was still the infection, the biological contaminant that had caused their Empress to malfunction. The door irised open and Zelia stepped inside. She looked exhausted. The brilliant gold of her gown had faded to a dull, translucent silver, and the light behind her eyes was flickering like a dying star. She didn't look like an empress. She looked like a woman who had carried a mountain for 3,000 years and was finally feeling the weight of the rocks. "You look like hell, Zelia," Arlo said, not turning away from the window. "And I say that as a man who once lived in a literal garbage chute for 6 months." Zelia stood beside him, her reflection ghostly against the backdrop of the planet below. "The Council is divided," she whispered. "They have accepted the restoration of Earth as a technical curiosity, but they see the precedent as a threat to the weave. Calith has been whispering in their ears. He calls my actions a bio-neurological breakdown caused by prolonged exposure to your species' erratic emotional frequencies." Arlo let out a short, bitter laugh. "So they think you caught a cold? And the symptoms are kindness and common sense? They think I am broken, Arlo, and they think the only way to fix the architect is to remove the stimulus that caused the break." Arlo finally turned to look at her. The humor left his face. "You mean me?" Zelia reached out, her hand trembling. Her fingers brushed his cheek, and for the first time, there was no static electricity, only a warmth that felt desperately, painfully human. "Calith has proposed a final correction. He believes that if you are removed from the equation, I will return to my baseline. He has convinced 3 of the counselors that your existence is a lingering error in the cosmic record." "So, what's the plan?" Arlo asked, his hand instinctively going to his hip where his plasma cutter used to be. "Do they airlock me while I'm sleeping, or is it going to be a big public spectacle with robes and singing?" "There will be no spectacle," Zelia said. "There is to be a hearing in 1 hour. You will be allowed to speak, but the decision has likely already been made. Calith has invoked the right of equilibrium. If I cannot prove that your presence adds more to the galaxy than it consumes, the law of the weave demands your reclamation." Arlo looked at the green world below. "You fixed that whole planet, Zelia. You turned a desert into a garden. If that doesn't prove I was worth the trouble, then your people are void blind. Logic does not recognize debt, Arlo. It only recognizes results." Arlo took a deep breath, the sterile air of the flagship tasting like copper in his mouth. "Then let's give them some results." The council chamber was a sphere of pure light. There were no chairs, only 12 platforms of solidified energy that floated in the center of the void. The counselors looked like statues carved from ice, their faces immobile, their thoughts hidden behind masks of perfection. Calith stood in the center, his silver armor polished to a mirror finish. "This creature is a scavenger," Calith's voice boomed, vibrating through the bones of everyone present. "He is a scavenger by nature, by trade, and by heritage. He lives off the decay of others. He contributes nothing to the weave. He creates nothing. He merely repurposes the failures of his ancestors." Arlo stood on a small, floating disk of light, feeling like a speck of dust in an engine. He looked up at the counselors. "You're right," Arlo said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I am a scavenger. I've spent my whole life picking through the trash. But you know what you find when you spend enough time in the junk piles? You find the truth." He looked at the counselor made of glass. "You see a broken ship. I see a crew that stayed at their posts until the oxygen ran out. You see a rusted data crystal. I see a love letter from a father to a daughter he'd never see again. I don't just find metal, Commander. I find the things that people thought were worth keeping when everything else was falling apart." Caliph sneered. "Sentimentality is not a contribution. It is a burden." "Is it?" Arlo asked. "Because it was sentimentality that made Zilia look at me and see something worth saving. And that choice saved a whole planet. You call me a parasite, but I'm the one who reminded your architect that a blueprint without a heart is just a drawing of a cage." The counselor of glass leaned forward. "You speak of kindness as a variable, but kindness is unpredictable. It creates chaos. How can we permit a variable of chaos to remain within the core of our Empress? Because chaos is the only thing that keeps the universe from turning into a graveyard," Arlo said. "Look at you. You're perfect. You're efficient. And you're so bored of your own perfection that you're willing to kill a whole species just because they're messy. I might be a glitch, but at least I'm awake. At least I'm feeling something besides the hum of an engine." Celia stepped forward, her light beginning to pulse with a new, fierce intensity. She looked at her people, her expression no longer one of a servant, but of a ruler. "Arlo Voss is not a glitch. He is a mirror. He showed me that the sovereign weave has become so focused on the pattern that we have forgotten the thread. We have become a machine that builds other machines. If we reclaim him, we are admitting that we are afraid of our own potential for growth." Caliph let out a low growling sound. "This is the infection speaking. She is compromised." "No," Zilia said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more power than Caliph's roar. "I am evolved." The counselors were silent for a long time. The light in the chamber shifted from white to a deep contemplative blue. Finally, the counselor of glass spoke. "The right of equilibrium remains. Arlo Voss has not yet proven his worth through action. However, the Empress has raised a valid point. The variable shall be tested." "Tested how?" Arlo asked, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "The ossuary of Ethelgard is currently undergoing structural collapse," the counselor said. "The energy surge from the Empress's miracle has destabilized the station's core. Within 4 hours, the station and the archive within it will be consumed by a localized singularity." Arlo felt the blood drain from his face. The archive, the letters, the songs, the woman in the flowers. "If Arlo Voss is truly a curator of the worth of his species," the counselor continued, "let him prove it. He will return to the station. He will retrieve the core memory of the human race from the heart of the archive. If he succeeds, he earns his place beside the Empress. If he fails, he will die with the ghosts he loves so dearly." "It's a suicide mission," Xylia said, her light flaring red. "The station is falling apart." "Then it is a fitting end for a scavenger," Caliph said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "To die in the junk pile he treasures so much." Arlo looked at Celia. He saw the terror in her eyes, the desperate need for him to stay. Then he looked at the green world below, and he thought of the millions of voices stored in those crystals. Voices that were the only family he had ever known. "I'll do it," Arlo said. "Arlo, no!" Zilia reached for him, but the counselor's energy field kept them apart. "I'm a scavenger, Zilia," Arlo said, giving her a wink that didn't quite reach his trembling eyes. "This is what I do. I go into the dark and I bring back the light. Just keep the coffee warm for me, okay?" The descent to the ossuary was a nightmare of screaming metal and violent turbulence. Arlo sat in the cockpit of a small sovereign scout ship, his hands white-knuckled on the controls. The ship was a marvel of technology, but it couldn't stop the station from tearing itself apart. Huge chunks of the tertiary spine were spinning off into the void, glowing cherry red as they collided with the station's own gravity well. Arlo guided the scout into Bay 9, the only docking port that wasn't currently on fire. The moment the hatch opened, he was hit by a wall of heat and the smell of burning circuits. The station was groaning, a deep tectonic sound that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He had 3 hours and 42 minutes before the singularity swallowed the sector. He didn't have his environment suit. He was wearing the sovereign tunic, which provided almost no protection against the radiation leaking from the fractured conduits. He grabbed a heavy-duty plasma torch from the scout's emergency locker and started running. The path to the archive was gone. The ventilation shafts were crushed, and the hydroponics bay was a swamp of boiling nutrient fluid. Arlo had to take the long way, through the industrial foundries and the main engine rooms. Every step was a gamble. The floor would buckle beneath him, or a steam pipe would burst, sending a jet of superheated vapor inches from his face. He was bleeding by the time he reached the central core. A piece of jagged shrapnel had sliced his arm, and his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He reached the archive doors. They were fused shut by the heat. Arlo took the plasma torch and began to cut, the blue flames sputtering in the thin air. "Come on, you piece of junk," Arlo hissed, his sweat stinging his eyes. "Don't you give up on me now." The doors groaned and slid open. The Hall of Records was a scene of beautiful devastation. The obsidian floor was cracked, and the holographic displays were flickering with erratic, dying energy. But the crystals were still there, thousands of them, glowing with the soft, amber light of human memory. Arlo ran to the central pedestal. The core memory crystal was a sphere the size of a melon, pulsing with a deep, golden frequency. It contained the compressed data of every piece of culture, art, and personal history humanity had ever managed to save. It was the soul of a species. He reached for it, but a voice stopped him. "You are remarkably persistent, Scavenger." Arlo turned. Caleth was standing at the far end of the hall. He wasn't wearing his helmet, and his face was twisted in a mixture of admiration and loathing. He was holding a sovereign pulse rifle, the barrel glowing with a deadly amethyst light. "Caleth," Arlo panted, clutching the core memory to his chest. "You really shouldn't have come. This place is about to turn into a black hole." "I came to ensure the equilibrium is maintained," Caleth said, stepping forward. "The Council thinks this is a test. I know it is a mercy. If you die here, Zilia will eventually forget you. The weave will return to its perfect, cold state." "You're obsessed, Caleth," Arlo said, backed against the pedestal. "You're so afraid of a little bit of feeling that you're willing to commit murder in a collapsing space station. Doesn't that seem a little illogical?" Caleth raised the rifle. "Logic demands the removal of the anomaly. You are the anomaly." Arlo looked at the core memory. Then he looked at the ceiling, where the metal was beginning to warp and glow. "You know, Caleth, you keep saying I contribute nothing, but I realized something on the walk over here." "What?" Caleth asked, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I realized that I'm the only one here who actually knows what he's dying for. You're dying for a math equation. I'm dying for a song." Arlo didn't lunge at Caleth. Instead, he slammed his fist into the archive's emergency manual override, a big red lever that had been designed to seal the archive in case of a total hull breach. The heavy lead-lined blast shutters slammed down between Arlo and Caleth. The purple bolt from Caleth's rifle hit the shutter with a deafening clang, but it didn't penetrate. Arlo was trapped inside the archive, and Caleth was locked out. But the singular reality remained. The station was dying. Arlo slumped against the pedestal, the golden sphere in his lap. He could hear the singularity beginning to howl in the engine room, a sound that wasn't a sound, but a vibration that tore at the very fabric of his being. He looked at the crystal. He touched it, and for a second a hologram flickered to life. It was a different video this time, an old man sitting on a porch playing a guitar. The music was faint, a simple 3-chord melody that sounded like home. Arlo smiled. He closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. He had done his job. He was a scavenger, and he had found the ultimate prize. It didn't matter if he didn't make it back. The archive was sealed. It would survive the singularity. It would drift in the void until someone else, someone kinder, found it. "I did it, Mom," Arlo whispered into the dark. "I saved the sky." Suddenly, the air in the archive began to shimmer. A rift of brilliant violet light opened in the center of the room. Zilia stepped through, her gown tattered, her skin glowing with a white-hot intensity that made the obsidian floor melt. "Arlo!" she screamed, running toward him. "Zilia?" Arlo gasped, his vision blurring. "What are you doing here? You're going to get caught in the pull." "I am an architect," she cried, grabbing his hand. "I do not follow the blueprints of others. I make my own." She grabbed the core memory and pulled Arlo to his feet. The station was literally dissolving around them. The walls were stretching, being pulled into the growing darkness of the singularity. "We have to go," Zilia yelled over the roar of the dying station. "I can't. I'm too heavy," Arlo said, his legs giving out. "Just take the crystals, Zilia. Save the ghosts." "No." Zilia's voice was a thunderclap. "I am not leaving the thread for the sake of the pattern. You are the reason I can see the ghosts, Arlo Voss. You are coming with me." She wrapped her arms around him, her light erupting into a blinding nova. Arlo felt a sensation of being stretched and squeezed, of being pulled through a needle's eye at the speed of light. He felt the cold of the void and the heat of a star. And then, nothing. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the deck of the Sovereign flagship. The High Council was standing around him, their faces illuminated by the violent purple explosion of the ossuary as it finally collapsed into a single, microscopic point of light. Celia was kneeling beside him, her head resting on his chest. She was sobbing, a messy, loud human sound that filled the sterile bridge. Arlo coughed, a cloud of soot and blood spraying onto the white floor. "Hey," he whispered, his voice a ghost of itself. Did I mention that the coffee on this ship is actually pretty good?" Zilia looked up at him, her violet eyes streaming with tears. "You are the most infuriating creature in the universe." Arlo grinned, his hand finding hers. "Yeah, but I'm your infuriating creature." He held up the core memory crystal. It was still glowing, a warm, golden heartbeat in the palm of his hand. The Counselor of Glass stepped forward. She looked at the crystal, and then at the scavenger who had nearly died to save it. She looked at the Empress who had defied her people to save the scavenger. "The equilibrium has been changed," the Counselor said, her voice filled with a strange new resonance. "The weave is no longer a machine. It is a story." She turned to the bridge crew. "Prepare a vessel. Arlo Voss and the architect are to return to the surface of the earth. They will be our ambassadors to the new world." Caliph stood at the back of the bridge, his armor scorched, his face a mask of silent defeat. He looked at the scavenger and the Empress, and for the first time, he didn't see an anomaly. He saw a beginning. Arlo leaned back, his eyes fixed on the green world below. He thought of the woman in the flowers. He thought of the man with the guitar. And then he looked at Zilia, the woman who had G-ed the threads of eternity just to keep him breathing. "We've got a lot of work to do, Empress," Arlo said. Zilia leaned her head against his shoulder. "I know, Scavenger, but at least we have plenty of scraps to start with." The descent to the surface of the earth did not happen with the violent roar of a chemical rocket or the bone-shaking scream of a re-entry pod. The Sovereign scout ship simply drifted through the atmosphere like a silver feather caught in a gentle updraft. Inside the cockpit, Arlo Voss sat with his hands resting lightly on his knees, his eyes wide and unblinking as he watched the clouds part. For 32 years, he had known only the charcoal gray of station bulkheads and the oppressive velvet black of the void. He had seen the stars as cold, distant points of judgment, but here, the world was exploding in colors he didn't have names for yet. There was a blue so deep it made his chest ache, and a green that looked like the very concept of life had been spilled across the dirt. "We are landing in the sector formerly known as the Mediterranean Basin," Zilia said softly. Her voice was still melodic, but the imperial resonance was gone, replaced by a weary, grounded warmth. "The soil here has the highest concentration of the bioregenerative lattice, IDG-ed. It is the heart of the new world, Arlo." Arlo didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt like it was full of the same dust he'd spent his life breathing, but this time, it was the dust of a dream. The ship touched down with a faint melodic chime as the grav repulsors disengaged. For a long minute, neither of them moved. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't the dead hush of the ossuary. It was a heavy, expectant silence, like a theater before the curtains rise. Arlo stood up, his legs feeling heavy in the planet's natural gravity. He walked to the hatch, his heart hammering against his ribs, those ribs that Zelia had knit together with her own light. He hit the manual release, and the door hissed open. The air hit him first. It wasn't the recycled metallic soup of the station. It was sharp, cold, and smelled of things he had only read about in the archive. It smelled of wet stone, of crushed grass, and of something sweet and heavy that he realized must be the flowers. He took a breath so deep it made him dizzy, his lungs protesting the sudden purity of the oxygen. "Step out, Arlo," Zelia urged, standing behind him. "You are the first human to breathe this air in over 2 centuries. The archive says you should say something profound." Arlo took a tentative step onto the ramp, his boots crunching on actual soil. He looked around at the rolling hills, the distant shimmer of a sea that was no longer a toxic sludge, and the sky that stretched on forever without a single bulkhead to stop it. "Profound," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I was thinking more along the lines of, holy scrap, it's beautiful." He walked down the ramp and knelt, his hands sinking into the dark, damp earth. It was cold and gritty, and it was the most real thing he had ever touched. He let out a shaky breath, a tear tracing a path through the soot on his cheek. Zelia joined him, her silver gown dragging in the mud. She didn't seem to care about the stains. She looked up at the sovereign flagship, a silent silver needle still hanging in the upper atmosphere, watching over them like a watchful god. "Commander Calith is departing," she said. "The High Council has ordered the fleet to the Perseus Arm to oversee a diplomatic crisis. We are alone, Arlo." "Alone," he repeated, looking at the golden sphere of the core memory sitting on the ramp of the ship. "With the ghosts of 10 billion people and a planet that hasn't seen a human footprint in 200 years. "Yeah, we're real lonely." A low, humming sound descended from the sky. A small, unmanned sovereign drone drifted down, depositing 3 large crates near the ship before banking and disappearing back into the clouds. "Parting gifts from the Council," Zelia explained. "Seed stock, basic fabrication tools, and enough high-density nutrient cells to last us 2 years. They are curious to see if the variable survives without a cage." Arlo walked over to one of the crates and pried it open. Inside were rows of small, transparent vials filled with seeds, each one meticulously labeled in both sovereign script and ancient English. Oak, wheat, lavender, rose. He looked at the seeds, then back at the vast, empty landscape. He realized then that the war was over, but the work was just beginning. He wasn't a scavenger anymore. There was nothing left to scavenge. He was a sower. "We need to find a place for the archive," Arlo said, his scavenger brain already mapping out the terrain. "Somewhere dry, somewhere safe. I reckon that ridge over there has some limestone caves. We can set up the primary interface, get the solar collectors running." Zelia watched him, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "You are already narrating, Arlo Voss. Are you preparing for your imaginary audience again?" Arlo laughed, a bright, genuine sound that seemed to surprise the birds that were beginning to circle overhead. "Old habits, Empress. Besides, someone has to tell the story of how a junk rat and a goddess decided to garden a graveyard." As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and fiery violet, a tall figure appeared on a holographic projection near the ship's ramp. It was Commander Calith. His image was flickering slightly, a long-range transmission from the flagship. "Radiance," Calith said, his voice stripped of its usual bite. "We are breaking orbit." Zelia stood tall, her presence still regal despite the mud on her hem. "Safe travels, Commander. May the weave guide your threads." Calith's gaze shifted to Arlo. "Scavenger." "Commander," Arlo replied, nodding. "The archive you retrieved, it is being studied by the historians in the capital," Calith said. "There is a song, something about a bridge over troubled water. The counselors have been playing it on a loop for 3 days. They do not understand the frequency, but it has caused a measurable increase in the biological harmony of the inner decks." He paused, his amethyst eyes searching Arlo's face. "Perhaps your species was not a failure of logic, Voss. Perhaps we were simply using the wrong math." Calith's image vanished, and a moment later, The silver needle in the sky flared with a brilliant white light before jumping into warp, leaving nothing but a fading trail of stardust behind. Arlo sat down on the grass, the weight of the day finally catching up to him. He looked at the golden sphere of the core memory, then at Zelia, who sat down beside him, her shoulder pressing against his. "You know," Arlo said, the slang slipping back into his voice as he relaxed. "I spent 28 years thinking that kindness was just a weakness people used to get close enough to steal your fusion cores. I thought the only way to survive was to be the hardest piece of scrap in the pile." "And now?" Zelia asked. "Now I think kindness is the hardest thing there is," he said, looking at his calloused hands. "It's easy to break things, Zelia. Any idiot with a plasma cutter can take apart a station. But building something, choosing to give a damn when the whole universe is telling you it's a waste of time, that's the real heavy lifting." Zelia leaned her head on his shoulder. "We have 2 years of supplies, one planet, and a million stories to tell. Do you think that is enough, Arlo?" Arlo looked at the first stars beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. He thought of the woman in the flowers, the man with the guitar, and the billions of lives waiting to be remembered. "Yeah," he whispered. "I reckon it's a pretty good start." The sun rose over the valley with a quiet, golden confidence that Arlo Voss had finally stopped taking for granted. It had been 365 days since they had landed, 1 full year of the Earth's long, slow breath. The limestone caves on the ridge had been transformed into the heart of the new archive, a place where the hum of sovereign technology blended with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Arlo stood on the porch of the small cabin he had built from a mix of scavenged ship plating and local timber. He was 42 years old now, though he felt younger than he had at 20. His hair was longer, tied back with a piece of synth cord, and his skin was tanned a deep bronze by a sun that didn't hide behind radiation shields. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden pipe. Not for smoking, but just to have something to fiddle with. He looked down at the valley floor. The wheat he had planted was a sea of shimmering gold, and the small orchard of apple trees was already beginning to show the first hints of fruit. A high-pitched whistle echoed through the valley. Arlo checked his wrist unit. The beacon was active. "They're here," he muttered, a grin spreading across his face. He walked down the hill toward the designated landing zone, a flat stretch of bedrock he had cleared 6 months ago. From the clouds, a battered, rust-streaked freighter descended. And it was a human ship, a long-range colony vessel from the Orion Fringe called the Persistence. It was the first of the refugee ships he had contacted using the Sovereign Long-Range Array. The ship landed with a hiss of steam and a groan of overstressed landing gear. The hatch creaked open, and a group of people stepped out. There were about 50 of them, men, women, and children, all wearing the drab, patched-up coveralls of the outer colonies. They looked exhausted, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe as they stared at the green world around them. At the head of the group was a woman with graying hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from asteroid rock. She held a kinetic rifle loosely in her hands, her eyes scanning the horizon for threats. "Identify yourself," she barked, her voice raspy from years of breathing recycled air. Arlo stepped forward, his hands empty and open. He wasn't wearing armor. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was wearing a simple tunic of woven flax and a pair of sturdy leather boots. "Name's Arlo Voss," he said, his voice steady. "Welcome home." The woman lowered her rifle slightly, her gaze suspicious. "We got a signal saying the earth was green again, saying there was a place for us. Who's in charge here? The Merchant Guild? The Concordat?" "Nobody's in charge," Arlo said, stepping closer. "We've got a sovereign architect who does the heavy lifting on the biosphere, and a former scrap rat who makes sure the stories don't get lost. Other than that, it's just us." The woman looked at the wheat fields, then back at Arlo. "What's the catch? What's the tax? We've got 12,000 credits in trade bars and some industrial grade A silicon. That enough for a plot of dirt?" Arlo felt a pang of his old life, the memory of bartering for every scrap of survival. He looked at the woman, seeing the same cynicism and fear that had once been his only companions. "Keep your credits," he said. "And put the gun away. We don't use those here. If you're hungry, we've got bread. If you're tired, we've got beds. All we ask is that you help us plant the next field." The woman stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. "You're just giving it away?" You know how many people would kill for a breath of this air? I know, Arlo said quietly. I used to be one of them. But we're trying something different here. We're trying to see if we can be better than the math says we are. A small girl, no more than 6 years old, stepped out from behind the woman's legs. She looked at the grass beneath her feet, then reached down and touched a small yellow wildflower. She looked up at Arlo, her eyes filled with a wonder that made the entire year of hard labor worth it. Is it real? She whispered. Arlo knelt down, his eyes level with hers. As real as it gets, kiddo, and it's yours. Just make sure you leave some for the bees, okay? The woman finally lowered her rifle completely. She looked at her people, then back at Arlo. I'm Sarah. We've got another 200 people in orbit waiting for the word. Tell them the air is fine, Sarah, Arlo said, standing up, and tell them to bring any books they've got. We're building a library. As the settlers began to unload their meager belongings, Arlo walked back up the hill. Zelia was waiting for him at the entrance to the archive. She was wearing a simple dress now, her violet light a soft, comforting glow in the shadows of the cave. They are afraid, she noted. They've spent their whole lives in the dark, Zelia, Arlo said. Kindness is a bright light. It takes a while for the eyes to adjust. He walked to the edge of the ridge, looking out over the valley. The sun was high now, the light reflecting off the golden sphere of the core memory that sat on a pedestal near the cabin. He thought about the man he had been a year ago. A man who would have seen these settlers as competitors for resources, as variables to be managed or exploited. He looked at his hands. They were stained with dirt, not blood. They were the hands of a man who had chosen to be a glitch in a cold universe. Arlo sat on the edge of the porch, the wood still warm from the sun. He picked up the wooden pipe and turned it over in his fingers. I spent 28 years in the belly of dead stations, thinking I was a historian because I saved a few old books and some dusty data crystals. I thought I was preserving humanity, but I was just a hoarder of ghosts. I was so busy looking backward at what we lost that I never realized we were still losing things every single day. Our mercy, our patience, our ability to look at a stranger and see a brother instead of a threat. I used to think the expansion era was our peak, but looking at Sarah and that little girl, I realized we were just children playing with bigger toys. The real expansion isn't across light years. It's across the 6 inches of space between one person's hand and another's. I'm 42 years old, and for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of tomorrow. Not because I have more credits or better armor, but because I've finally learned that the only thing that actually survives the void is the stuff you give away. We're a messy, loud, and often broken species, but we've got this one beautiful glitch in our code. We can choose to be kind when it costs us everything. And as long as we keep doing that, the stars will always have a reason to keep burning. Arlo looked up as Zelia joined him, handing him a mug of coffee. Real coffee, grown in the valley. The steam rose in the cool morning air, a small, white ghost of its own. You're thinking again, she said. Just wondering, Arlo replied, taking a sip. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the green hills met the blue sky, thinking of all the people still out there in the dark, waiting for a signal. I spent my life scavenging the ruins of the past, only to find that the most valuable thing I ever discovered was a stranger who needed a meal. It makes me wonder about you, out there in your own version of the void. In a world that often feels like a cold, dying station, have you found your glitch yet? Have you ever taken a risk on a stranger or shared your last bit of hope with someone who had nothing to give you back? What would happen to your world if you decided, just for today, that kindness was more important than the math? Arlo Voss stood up, adjusted his tunic, and walked down the hill to help a father carry a heavy crate of old clothes toward their new home. The sun caught the golden sphere on the pedestal, and for a moment, the whole valley was filled with a light that didn't come from the sky.